we've had worse problems.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, wow. Here we go. Now the attendees are filtering in. All right. Good afternoon. We still have folks joining, it looks like, so give us a couple of minutes here as we let the invite list here populate. And once I see that ticker stop, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. All right. Well, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luke Mish. I'm a planner here at the Department of Planning and Development. Thank you all for joining us for our kickoff webinar of the Climate Infrastructure Fund, part of the Chicago Recovery Plan. You see some faces here on the screen from various folks here at the city. You'll hear from many of us today. A few kind of quick notes about how today's meeting will run, and then we'll jump right into the presentation slides. This is being run as a Zoom webinar. So for those of you who might not be as familiar with that platform, you have the opportunity at the bottom of your screen to click on the Q&A button and enter any questions that you have there. We will be keeping an eye on that through the presentation. But we may hold on answering some of those questions until the Q&A portion of the meeting at the end, just if there are some that require a little bit more discussion or a lengthier response. But if there's any kind of low-hanging fruit, those we'll try to answer throughout the presentation. I think you all probably have the ability to raise your hands, but I will just note, given the large number of attendees, we've got about 140 folks at the moment, and we're expecting possibly up to another 100 more based on the number of registrations we had today. Managing that kind of live hand-raising microphone stuff is probably not going to be feasible with a group this large. So do please use the Q&A function. And please note that any questions that we receive that we don't have a chance to get to today, we will find a way to answer either directly by reaching out to you all via email and or posting any responses to our FAQs on our website. More to come on all of the kind of web resources that we have, although I'm assuming many of you are aware of those given your registration and your appearance today. So without any further ado, I will jump into the slide deck here and we will get started. All right. Oh, and do please note, I've got a little warning here from Zoom. Do please note we are recording this session and we will make this recording available online. So you can feel free to reference it at your leisure or share it with others who may have missed today. All right, so again, welcome. As part of the Chicago Recovery Plan, we are excited to announce the Climate Infrastructure Fund, which is part of DPD's, the Department of Planning and Development's suite of Chicago Recovery Plan projects related to climate and climate initiatives. Before we get started on our full agenda, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Commissioner Kathy Dickett to kind of give us a brief introduction in terms of how this fits into some broader initiatives that DPD is leading.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. We're very excited about being able to launch this in partnership with the Mayor's Office. And this type of project fits perfectly with We Will Chicago, and We Will Chicago is the first citywide plan that Chicago has undertaken since the 1960s. And I'm really happy to say that that plan is being introduced to Chicago Plan Commission this January 19th for approval. And one of as with any citywide plan, we talk about quality of life drivers and issues facing the city. And one of the issues, well, one of many issues, but we did talk a lot about environment, climate, and energy. There's a pillar on that. Angela Tovar here was the co-chair of that particular working group. And there are several goals which really will be, which this program will help actualize, right? So, prioritize climate resiliency efforts in Black, Latino, and Native American communities and for low-income individuals through both public and private sector efforts. And this project does that. Use environmental justice principles to establish criteria and policies for geographies harmed by environmental degradation, and mitigate and eliminate sources of carbon emissions in alignment with national and global climate goals. So we're really excited to see what kinds of projects you have in mind that can address equity, resiliency, and these goals that we have articulated in We Will Chicago. And it also aligns with other initiatives, which I know Angela will talk about. And I'll turn it over to her. Where'd you go?
Thank you so much, Kathy. And hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many familiar names in the participant list. And it's an honor to be here with you all this afternoon and to join Kathy in kicking us off. I know many of you have heard me speak about climate before. And, when we talk about climate change in the context of the city of Chicago, our work here and our goal is really to equitably advance solutions that not only lower our emissions as the city and drastically reduce our emissions, but are also aimed at improving the quality of life for our residents and driving community benefits that our neighborhoods need to thrive. And for us, 2022 was such a major step forward in achieving our holistic climate goals. We released, not only did we get to participate in We Will Chicago, we also released in April of 2022 our climate action plan, which set an ambitious goal of reducing our carbon emissions by 62% by 2040. And then in addition to that, we also divested the city's financial assets from fossil fuel, which is another exciting achievement of the year. We positioned the city to reach our 2025 goal of achieving 100% renewable energy for our own municipal operations. And that means by 2025, major operations in the city of Chicago, including O'Hare and Midway and Jardine, our water pumping station, will all be 100% renewable energy, which has been really exciting. And then in addition to that, we're following the state CEJA guidelines for equity and workforce criteria. So in addition to that this project will bring new opportunities for equity eligible workforce development, as well as new opportunities for project labor agreements and other workforce agreements that we are working in coordination with our contractor to provide. And so we're very excited about the new workforce ecosystem that we're creating for both Chicago and Illinois residents to help advance our clean energy future. And then, of course, our most recent goal, which was planting 20,000 trees through our Route Chicago initiatives. And the exciting part of that is really coordinating and partnering with not only community folks who are invested in the tree canopy in the city of Chicago, but also working in close coordination with our health department so that we can collectively determine, based on health data and lived experience, where trees need to be planted the most throughout the city. So we are very excited about all we've achieved in 2022 and are looking forward to what we can do in 2023 collectively. And a big part of that is putting financial resources in the hands of our nonprofit organizations and our small business leaders to help realize their vision for a sustainable future. And we know that environmental justice communities who have been historically overburdened are especially vulnerable to climate change. And, we welcome and prioritize responses from organizations and businesses that represent our EJ communities. So very grateful to be on this call. Very excited to see the turnout today. And Looking forward to reviewing applications. And with that, I can turn it back over to Luke.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Kathy. All right, well, let's get started on what I know many of you are here to understand a little bit more about, which is the Climate Infrastructure Fund, how it works, what it's all about, and how you all can get involved. So today we're going to go over a few things. We'll give an overview of the fund as a program. We'll list out some of the project types that are eligible that we're looking to fund through this. And give some examples of similar projects, not all of which are in Chicago, but I think show a good example of the kinds of projects we're looking to support. We'll go over how to apply, and then we'll talk a little bit about what makes a successful application. And then finally, we'll close with Q&A. So again, throughout the presentation, feel free to add questions to the Q&A box. If we can answer them as we go, we will, but we'll have plenty of time at the end here to have more of a discussion on any of those questions. So I'll start with the program overview. You've heard a little bit about how the Climate Infrastructure Fund fits into the broader ecosystem of what we do, not only at the Department of Planning and Development, but with our partners in the mayor's office and kind of across the city. The fund is part of the Chicago Recovery Plan, which, as many of you may know, is part of the transformative funding opportunities that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic. $1.2 billion in new investments is made possible by the Chicago Recovery Plan. Some of that falls into the equitable economic recovery category, things that are aimed at recovering from the economic losses of the pandemic, and some programs that are aimed at thriving in safe communities, which are looking to build back better opportunities within our communities moving forward. DPD, the Department of Planning and Development specifically, is leading several programs across the community development, small business and workforce support, and community climate investments categories, totaling over $237 million. And the Climate Infrastructure Fund, of course, being part of that community climate investment category, it's part of a broader climate investment, climate and environmental investment suite that spans not only DPD, but other agencies and departments, as you heard Angela mention, $188 million total in climate and environmental justice, which is the largest investment in city history. So what is the fund itself? Well, the purpose of the program is to accelerate Chicago's transition to the green economy. And we're doing that by seeding climate projects that align with the Climate Action Plan, specifically the goal of reducing emissions by 62% by the year 2040, and doing it in an equitable way with co-benefits to all in the community. So what are we aiming to do with these grants? Well, we'll be promoting solar and other community-based renewable energy. We will be funding the decarbonization of buildings and supporting energy efficiency improvements to find opportunities to make our building stock more sustainable. We'll be increasing electric vehicle ownership and the presence of associated charging infrastructure. So we know that one path towards kind of the green economy is through the transportation sector, which is currently, a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And we'll also be improving resilience infrastructure. So how can we better prepare our neighborhoods and our communities and our built environment for the shocks of climate change? How do we recuperate from those? How do we make sure that we are building in those safeguards moving forward? So the grant itself, the Climate Infrastructure Fund grant, is open to nonprofit organizations and small businesses. The award amounts that we're targeting are between $50,000 and $250,000. However, we do have the opportunity to consider grant amounts that are both less than that and more than that. And so we'll look at those on a case-by-case basis, but the kind of sweet spot for what we're looking to support is the $50,000 to $250,000 amount. In terms of project types, and we'll go over this more in a bit, We're looking at renewable energy and energy efficiency projects, electric vehicles and EV charging projects, and green infrastructure. So Kathy touched on this a little bit. I won't spend a ton of time here, but DPD definitely sees the Climate Infrastructure Fund as part of the implementation process of the We Will Chicago plan, the We Will Chicago guiding document. That document is organized around 8 pillars, thematically kind of grouping different goals and objectives. And several of those really touch on what we're looking to do here with the Climate Infrastructure Fund. So for those who are not familiar with the draft, I highly recommend going to wewillchicago.com and getting familiar with it. And as Kathy noted, more to come on that front here in the beginning of 2023. The Climate Infrastructure Fund also, of course, connects to the Climate Action Plan. And again, Angela touched on a lot of this, but that document, also organized into thematic pillars, saw several goals and objectives that really tie to what we're trying to do with the Climate Infrastructure Fund, from retrofitting buildings and connecting to renewable energy, to enabling zero emission transportation, and just broadly enabling community resiliency. So we're going to go into a little bit of depth of what the kinds of projects are that we are looking to fund here. And so again, those 3 broad categories are renewable energy and energy efficiency, electric vehicles and EV charging infrastructure, and green infrastructure. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lindy Wordlaw, on the sustainability team in the mayor's office to step through some of these examples.
Thank you, Luke. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here. As Luke mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3 kind of distinct project areas in the Climate Infrastructure Fund, what they entail, and provide some examples, some best practices that we want to just share with you, not all of which are in Chicago, but very good examples to kind of get the juices flowing, if you will, for some of the ideas that you may want to consider for your nonprofit organizations and small businesses. So the first category we'll talk about is renewable energy and energy efficiency. And the goal here is to really reduce emissions in our built environment as much as we can, and increase our reliance on renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels. And so in these types of projects, we're thinking about, funding the installation of, say, solar panels or perhaps other forms of renewable energy. And also looking at energy efficiency upgrades, whether that's improving the building envelope with air sealing and insulation, thinking about HVAC, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and perhaps with electric heat, such as heat pumps, and looking at lighting. In some buildings, lighting can represent a significant portion of energy consumption, and so really thinking about that comprehensively. And then other areas of energy consumption, such as water heaters. Perhaps if you're a restaurant, looking at the cooktops and moving away from fossil fuel cooking as well. So one example of that, if you go to the next slide, is this is an example that's just south of our city borders, an organization. They go by SOUL, Sustainable Options for Urban Living. They're a workforce training company. They also have a small business for-profit in construction that's actually within Chicago. They participated in a program and did a very comprehensive retrofit of their site and when I say comprehensive, I'm talking about looking at every single way that they could really reduce their energy consumption. And so what we see here is a description of what they did. They installed a heat pump to take over for a boiler, a pretty intensive look at the lighting, both inside the building and outside, as well as light controls. They installed an EV charging station as well, and any of the appliances within the facility were upgraded to the most efficient ones possible. And their annual savings is pretty big, over 230,000 kilowatt hours each year. And so if you are familiar with those types of numbers, you understand that is a lot of savings right there. So if we go on to the next category, and we'll be taking questions about these. This next one is electric vehicles and EV charging infrastructure. Another area when we talk, Angela mentioned the climate plan last year. Transportation is another area where we want to reduce our emissions and therefore our impact. And so this is another area by really thinking about how we travel about the city. There are multiple ways to do this, but one sure way is to get rid of those gasoline cars when we can, and purchase electric vehicles. And so this particular area is looking at not only the purchase of electric vehicles or even fleet. Perhaps you have 3 or 4 vehicles, and this is an opportunity to do that, while at the same time installing the charging infrastructure. Or we say charging infrastructure, but basically what we mean is an electric vehicle or EV charging station so that you can actually plug in your vehicle. We're very much aware that there are not many of these in a lot of communities. I think there are more community areas in Chicago without EV charging stations than there are with. And so this is a real opportunity to start to change that and change what that looks like in Chicago. Next slide. So one example right here in Chicago is in Back of the Yards, Plant Chicago, a great organization that focuses on circular economy. I would encourage you to go check out their website and see what they do. They installed 2 level 2 charging stations. We won't necessarily go over all the language and terminology today, but there are different different levels of charging stations. Would encourage you to get a little familiar with that, especially if you're thinking about this funding area. And so they've installed those and they've made them available to the community. They use an online platform where people like the folks here are shown they can reserve and plug in their cars, and they charge a nominal fee, which really pretty much covers the cost of their electricity and running it on the platform. So this is just one example. If you look at any number of online platforms that aim to match people with available charging stations, you'll start to see that they are starting to pop up around, and the number of them change every day. It's really interesting to see how this is playing out in Chicago, but it'll start to give you an idea of what is out there right now. But just to be clear, that example I just used was a charging station, but the projects can cover the purchase of an actual vehicle or a charging station or both. Next slide. So the next area is green infrastructure. This is the third and final project area. And really the aim for green infrastructure is to help improve our community resiliency by reducing the impact of increased precipitation. And green infrastructure, as it says right here, collects stormwater from paved and unpaved surfaces to filter and absorb it where it falls, to reduce the amount that's actually going into the sewer system. As some of you may know, we have a combined sewer system, and when inundated with lots of rain, we occasionally have flooding, and sometimes very serious flooding. And so this is one way to start to think about how do we address that. And as shown here, there are a number of allowable expenses: native plantings and soil systems, permeable pavers, whether it's on things that are formerly paved over, including your parking lot, and then even stormwater harvest and reuse. Now, the types of projects here can vary. Some of you may be familiar with kind of the big, like a community garden type solution where there's a vacant lot and it's filled with carefully planned out greening and other solutions to absorb water. But on the flip side, you might have something that's kind of smaller scale, just at your property level to do your part, say, whether it's, taking that paved over parking lot or changing your, landscaping that requires you to water it every day in the summer to something with native plantings that can, maybe absorb a little bit more heat and need less water. There's a number of examples that you might want to consider at the site level. And so let's go on to the next slide is an example. There are some resources. I think they're up on the website. If not, they will be soon. We grabbed this information from City of Philadelphia, actually, that runs a very extensive program. They've been doing it for quite some time in green infrastructure. That they have a grant program for private property owners. And so we like this example. This is a family-owned restaurant, and they simply put in 2 rain gardens in their parking lot and have just a small amount, as you see here on the side, less than an acre. And they're doing their share to reduce stormwater and heavy rains. Up to over 11,000 gallons can be captured. And so we thought this was a great example to kind of start getting you thinking about ideas, whether you have a parking lot or just, what can you do on your property to be thinking about these things. And then I also want to highlight, Luke talked about the Chicago Recovery Plan at the beginning. And there are a number of inward-facing city-led climate initiatives too. We are thinking about these things too. This is just a few of them that we are working in these areas too. So one example, we are looking at libraries, and we've done assessments on about 16 of them to think about where are we best suited to put solar on the rooftops of some libraries. And while we're doing that, making sure that the building that we're putting them on is as energy efficient as possible. That's a really exciting project that is getting underway. And we actually had a meeting today talking about how are we doing this and making sure that we are engaging our Black and brown contractors while we're doing this. We are also looking at fleet electrification. We have purchased upwards of 106 charging stations that are now being installed. By middle to end of this year, we'll have about 180 or so of the light duty vehicles that will be in the city's fleet, which represents about 10% of the city's fleet, that those will be swapped with electric vehicles as well. And also really thinking about, okay, this is just, that's 10%. That's not a lot. It's a start. And thinking about how are we informing our bigger picture? How do we eventually get to the point where all of our light duty are electric vehicles, and as much of our medium and heavy duty that are possible. And so that's one other area that we're working in this space. And then in green infrastructure, there's a couple of different projects within the Chicago Recovery Plan. I thought I'd highlight Space to Grow, which is not a city-only project. It is a partnership with led by the Healthy Schools campaign, and in partnership with the city, Chicago Public Schools, and the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which is a program to identify schools in Chicago Public Schools that we take the schoolyard, oftentimes a play space that may not, it could use some upgrades anyway, and we upgrade the play equipment, we upgrade the space so that it is able to capture stormwater and also kind of serve as a learning laboratory for students and teachers as well. And so this has been, I think, 32 or 34 sites have been done. 4 of them last year were completed with Chicago Recovery Plan dollars, and we expect to do more of them in the coming couple of years with Chicago Recovery Plan dollars as well. Next slide, please. So I will turn it back over to Luke to talk about how to apply. I'll be back in a little bit to discuss the application process, and happy to answer any questions that we can on today's webinar, as well as taking additional questions after as well.
Great, thank you, Lindy. So, okay, I think everyone's got a little bit of an understanding of the kinds of projects the fund is able to support. So who can apply and what do funds cover? Well, again, the application is open to 501c3 nonprofit organizations and small businesses More to come on that in a moment. Priority is given to applicants located in or serving populations in historically underserved, under-resourced, and environmental justice communities. More on that in a moment as well. I know we've got some questions about exactly what we mean by those terms. Again, you've heard about what the project types are themselves, but in terms of eligible expenses, those will include pre-development costs, such as the energy assessments that are needed to understand what kind of energy improvements should be done in a building, or the development of site plans, hiring an engineer or a landscape architect to design green infrastructure projects, or an engineer or specialist to review and design improved electrical capacity for an EV charging station. Those pre-development funds are eligible costs, as is, of course, the construction and renovation itself. Again, these are for permanent capital improvement projects. So the project categories and the eligible expenses are based on permanent capital improvement projects. So that means funding is not available for ongoing operations and maintenance. It is purely for the capital investment itself. And then we've got some specific eligible expenses that we can talk about here in a moment. Of course, all of this will then get, once the applications have rolled in and are reviewed, we kind of go line by line to understand what is eligible from each application. So the portal itself opened on Monday, December 19th. That was right before the holiday. So what we've done is given a longer application period than we may normally do. We wanted to make sure that this, got out there before the first of the year, but applications are open until February 24th. So almost to the end of February. All the information about the fund, including how to apply, is available at chicago.gov/climate fund. When you go to that site, you can scroll down to the bottom and you'll see the link to the online application. That is how all applications are going to be accepted for the fund, is via the online application process. To do that, you'll need to make a submittable.com account. It's a free account. It is simply a web interface to fill out the online application. And so you'll fill out first a project assessment. So this will be a handful of questions just to understand kind of where you are in your project planning and kind of what you're aiming to do. And if from that point the assessment triggers eligibility to fill out the full application, you'll be directed that way. It may tell you, based on your responses to the project assessment, there's more kind of pre-work that you might need to do before applying. And so that will direct you to our resources. We haven't gotten to this point of the presentation yet, but we do anticipate the potential for future rounds of this fund. So this, if for whatever reason you have a great idea, but maybe you don't have the pieces lined up to get started here in February, it is almost certainly not going to be your last chance. We are anticipating another round of the fund later this year. So again, you'll complete the project assessment and then you'll be directed to the online application itself, which you may save and continue later. You don't have to fill it all out in one sitting, but you will be asked to upload files. You'll be asked to review for accuracy and completeness, and then you must click submit. So simply hitting save does not submit. You must click submit for us to receive it. So we'll talk a little bit about what makes a successful application. We've got a handful of priorities here that we want to touch on. And I might actually ask Lindy to jump in here to walk us through a little bit of this.
Sorry, they're having trouble unmuting. Sure, thanks, Luke. And I'll touch on what each of these mean in just a second, or the two of us will, but really, so every submitted application that we get, we will be reviewing. We are prioritizing projects that have a strong local impact. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. You know, how are we thinking about what that local impact is? We're prioritizing projects in environmental justice communities. I've already received questions on that, and I'll share with you what we mean by that in a second as well. And then we really want to see projects that, we know there's lots of great ideas out there, but we want to see projects that demonstrate that they will be able to break ground, get started on implementing these in 2023. That is definitely preferred. And we also prefer that you have site control. Now, site control, what we mean by that is you either own the property or you have proof for long-term permission and use of the property. So, for example, if you are renting your site, you have permission from the owner to say put solar panels on, or to, if you're a community organization and you're thinking about green infrastructure, and there's this great lot that you saw that's for sale in the Shy Builder program, and you're thinking about that, like, that we want to see that you either have site control, are pursuing it, or have permission for use of it from the owner. And in those cases, in the latter, where you have permission from the owner, that that would not be, we're not doing that with Shy Builder. I want to be clear that no letters will be going out through that program, but I'm thinking of people who, private entities that already own a property. Those letters of permission to use a property they own would need to come from those. Next slide. So, and I'll go over each of these again in a little bit more detail, but we have a series of criteria that we will be using to review every submitted proposal. And they generally fall into three areas: climate, equity, and project feasibility. So climate are really looking at, what are the metrics of what you're doing? Are you reducing emissions? Are there significant environmental benefits that your project would achieve? We want to make sure that those are explicitly said and shared. And those, I'll talk about that again in a minute, but like that could be any number of things. Equity, how are, where is this project happening? Is it happening in an area that has been severely impacted by climate and any number of other challenges? Are there any other opportunities for workforce and that kind of thing? And then again, project readiness. Do we think that, you'll be able to break ground on this year? Or, is this something that can be finished relatively, over the next year or two? We really want to see that that the project makes sound sense, and that you understand what it's going to take for the long-term implementation of this. We don't just want to see that you're putting in an EV charging station, but understand that there are some implications for longer term operations and how you'll need to handle that in your organization. Or how for green infrastructure, there are different maintenance challenges with green infrastructure, even with permeable pavers, that you need to be aware of, and we need to be able to see that you understand what those challenges are, and that you're up for the task. Your organization or small business is up for the task. Next slide. So let's dig into environmental justice communities. We've already, like I said, we've already received questions for that. And what we decided to not recreate the wheel. There are some really good tools out there that are based on a lot of research, a lot of data, and really smart people thinking about these things already. And so we are looking at two different tools to identify just who is in an environmental justice community. And so the first tool is brand new. The White House Council on Environmental Quality put together a new tool similar to an old tool that you might be familiar with, but this new one came out, I believe, in November of 2022. It's called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. You can search US address by US address to see if it's in one of the census tracts. This tool is actually being used to help what the Biden administration calls the Justice 40 priorities, which is a goal to assure that at least 40% of the clean energy incentives and dollars are spent in environmental justice communities. If you want to understand a little bit more about how this whole screening tool is developed, there's a link that when you get the PDF of these slides, you can click on all of these and read a little bit more about that. And I will say that this screening tool is new. And when you put in an address, it is a little funny in how it's accepting addresses. And I imagine that will be fixed. And partly because of that reason, we also wanted to look at another tool that is state of Illinois. And so the state of Illinois defined environmental justice communities within the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, and it is in use in a number of capacities, including by the Illinois Power Agency, which oversees the state's long-term renewable resources procurement plan. And so we are also using a lookup that they have in one of their programs for Illinois Solar for All. If you click on this link, that is here, once you get the PDF of the slides or Google it, you will be able to look up your address to see if it's an environmental justice community. So all this is to say that as we are looking at applications, those that are organizations and small businesses within environmental justice communities and projects that are proposed to be cited within environmental justice communities will be prioritized heavily. Next slide. And then we're also looking at a number of other socioeconomic indicators as well. For example, this is just giving you a little bit of flavor of some of the things that we're looking at. The Chicago Community Area Hardship Index, it put together an economic hardship index that's based on the six factors, metrics here. And so kind of thinking about unemployment and education, income, poverty, housing, and dependency, or basically age, are some of the factors that play into this. And so we'll be looking at other socioeconomic factors like that as we start to kind of look at the proposals and prioritizing those that are facing deeper burdens than others. Next slide. So I want to dig in a little bit more to the criteria and what we mean. So when we talk about climate impact, we want to see projects that are reducing emissions that cause climate change, or are increasing the ability to withstand our already changing conditions. And if you think about the three project areas, we've kind of talked about where those fall. And so from climate mitigation, does it cite a reduction of emissions? Whether that is, in some way, are you showing that there will be a reduction of emissions? And whether that's, reducing your overall energy consumption, are you eliminating natural gas consumption by fuel switching from electricity to natural gas? And then from resilience, are you citing these improvements that are helping the community or people or even your organization to withstand these climate-related weather changes? And then, also as we think about these impacts, these can be described in different ways. Qualitatively, are you providing numbers? And how are you calculating them? Or even if you're estimating things, if you're private, well, I mix that up. If you're describing them more generally, what the impact is versus quantitatively, have you made calculations to what those emissions reductions are? We just really want to understand that you understand what your climate impact is by implementing said proposed project idea. Next slide. So when we think about equity, how are you thinking about equity? Does the project reduce barriers for the community or your organization or business or individuals to be able to take part in climate action or improve resiliency? Oftentimes, I believe Angela reiterate this at the front end that, we know that in many of our communities in Chicago, there are organizations and businesses who are just, they aren't able to take part in a lot of these strategies. And this is really trying to level that playing field, if you will, to allow people to do that. And we would like to see evidence of that and noting of that in the proposals that you put forth. We just talked about environmental justice. So is the organization and or the project site in a designated environmental justice area? Economic justice, when applicable, does the project explicitly intend to provide opportunities for local workforce or BIPOC workforce? And then when applicable, are you citing cost savings? Do these actions reduce costs for small businesses and organizations in environmental justice communities? And then I'll turn it back over, Luke, I'll turn it back over to you if you want to talk a little bit more about project readiness. I feel like we've talked about this already, but kind of hitting home on a couple of key things.
Yeah. Thanks, Lindy. So again, the three criteria that will be the three kind of criteria categories that we'll be reviewing applications are along our climate, equity, and project readiness. So this is, equally part of the puzzle here. And so when we're thinking about, is this a project that, has shown enough kind of planning and forethought where we're confident that, not only is it a worthy idea, but it can actually get to the finish line. And so these are some of the things that we're going to be looking at, to make a successful application. Number one is site control. And again, as Lindy alluded to earlier, best case scenario, it is a property that you own, but we're also going to consider properties that applicants maybe are in the process of acquiring, or properties that may be owned by others, but leased or otherwise used by the applicant, where there is a relationship there, a documented relationship that allows for that tenant or lessee to make those improvements. So site control is a key element for us. A plan for construction and installation. So again, the application will ask for specific elements along this, and we'll be looking to make sure that that applicants are putting together a knowledgeable plan about when the project will start, what's needed to make that happen, how long the project will take. Again, we are allowing applications to come in without some of the kind of, let's call it pre-work, the pre-development activities, without those being completed. So something like an energy assessment. If you're considering improvements to your building envelope, to your heating, venting, and cooling systems, you'll need an energy assessment to tell you exactly what kinds of improvements to make. We are accepting applications from folks who maybe haven't done that homework yet, and who actually want to fund that energy assessment with these grants. That's totally eligible. However, given that this is a competitive grant process, anybody who has completed that already at the time of application, all other things equal, that would make for a stronger application. So, we're looking for folks, we're looking for applicants who have, started to think about this as a process, but absolutely open to those who maybe are in the early stages as well. We're looking at your itemized costs and your budget. Have you developed an actual budget for the project? Have you thought through all of the kind of subcomponents of the project? Have you thought about costs that will be incurred that the grant won't fund? We mentioned we won't be able to cover operations and maintenance. So if you are considering a green infrastructure installment, have you indicated that there's an ongoing maintenance cost that you are aware of, that you're going to be either fundraising for separately or making room within your operating budget to cover those? We want to make sure that that these projects have longevity, and the grant funds themselves will only go so far towards that. And again, I think that's kind of what the last bullet point alludes to as well. So not only in terms of the cost, but in terms of the process. Perhaps there's new staff you might need to hire to manage or maintain some of these systems, or maybe training for existing staff to understand how to use new HVAC equipment that gets installed. So thinking about not just, how do we get to the kind of the date of installation, but how do we make this a successful investment for years to come? So that kind of covers a lot, but it doesn't cover everything. We couldn't possibly kind of read through all of the different resources and things that we have prepared for the fund. So we really encourage folks to go to chicago.gov/climate fund. That is the homepage for the Climate Infrastructure Fund. You'll notice here on this kind of screenshot of the website, we're under the Climate Investments banner of the broader DPD Chicago Recovery Plan website. So there are other top-line resources here for other programs that you may or may not be familiar with, things like our ETOD, Equitable Transit Oriented Development Program, the community development grants, which are all part of the Chicago Recovery Plan. But for the Climate Infrastructure Fund, the site is organized around giving a program overview, a little bit more about what we talked about today. And then in the side panel here, a lot of resources. We've got an actual resources page that has links to all sorts of great information from the federal government resources, state government resources, utility companies who may provide, lists of installers or other resources, opportunities to schedule energy assessments. We've got a ton of resources about each of the different project types, and we will continue to add to that over not just the next 2 months while this window of the application is open, but for as long as this program continues. I guarantee we will continue to add bullet points to that resources page. So do check back often. And then we do have an FAQ page. We'll be updating that later this week with all the great questions we're getting from you all now. We'll make sure that anything that's not clear up there today, becomes clear this week. So again, check back there often. Folks email us and we add questions and answers up there pretty frequently. Obviously, you all found today's Zoom, so that's great. We are anticipating another one later, early in February, in about a month's time, a little less than a month's time, actually, at this point. The content of that may be a little bit different depending on kind of where we are in application processes. We'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, and so this is where the webinar recordings and the slide decks themselves will also live. So with that, I'll pause and see what kind of questions we have. Thank you, everyone who's been dropping those into the Q&A. I know many have been answered, but I know there's probably many that we can answer here live. So I'll ask my colleague, David Conway, to kind of point us in the right direction here of what we might want to answer first.
It got it right on 1 second here. So one question that I saw was that somebody was curious that if they made, for example, an electric vehicle purchase for their nonprofit in the past, or if it's going to happen in February before the deadline for applications, can funds be used retroactively towards, money that's already been spent, or must purchases be made after a grant is awarded?
That's a good question. I don't know that I know the answer to that off the top of my head. We can get back to you on that unless someone else on the team here knows that for a fact one way or the other. I will say if it's possible to allow funds to be used for a retroactive purchase or installation, that purchase or installation would still need to meet all of the criteria of a new purchase or installation. So if we're talking specifically in this case about an electric vehicle, the guidelines about what kind of vehicle that is would need to have been met. I don't know if Lindy or Brad, is that something you know off the top of your head?
I think we'd have to have conversations about that to determine.
Yeah.
Determine it, because I was thinking that it is not eligible, but we should talk about that.
Okay. Yeah. Good question though. Thank you.
Got it. I saw a number of questions along these lines, but somebody had asked whether they could receive a climate infrastructure grant in tandem with TIF funding from the city or other grant support from the city.
Yes, short answer is yes. There's no preclusion from eligibility across multiple grants. The application process itself is part of the broader DPD Universal Grant application. So all grant programs kind of in this space are using the same application, which allows us to coordinate across teams. So you do need to apply separately to each source of funding. TIF is, of course, its own process, but for something like the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund or the Community Development Grants, that application, it's the same application setup. You do need to hit submit, I believe. Well, no, hold on. Let me not misspeak. I believe you can just submit. When you fill out the application, it'll ask you, based on what you're trying to do with your project, kind of it'll start to sort you into the appropriate program. And so if your project is primarily climate focused, it'll come our way. If in your description of your project you have expenses that maybe aren't fit for us, but maybe an opportunity for another fund, there's things we can do to work through that on the back end. But nothing precludes you from accessing grant funds from multiple programs.
Got it. I had seen a question that I know that an announcement on this first round of applications is expected by late spring, but somebody was curious about, if someone is selected as a grant recipient, how soon can they expect to receive funding?
Yeah, so the funding schedule, first of all, it's a reimbursement-based funding schedule. So announcements, again, as David mentioned, are going to be expected in late spring. Then there's a period where we're kind of dotting I's and crossing T's on the grant agreement itself, essentially the contract between the recipient and the city regarding the funds. And then, the project gets underway. This is this is our inaugural launch here of the Climate Infrastructure Fund. So I can't speak to prior experience, but what I know from other similar programs is there's an opportunity for multiple disbursements. Again, they're always reimbursement disbursements. So essentially, there can often be an early disbursement for some prorated portion of the overall grant total that might be applied towards pre-development costs that were incurred to even submit the application. So let's say you go out and you get an energy assessment, and you've hired an engineer or a designer to come up with some ideas for you to even apply. Those are costs that you've incurred on the front end. And so once the grant agreement has been finalized, we can make an opportunity, I believe, to cover the pre-development portion of the total grant, if that makes sense. But otherwise, it's at major milestones of the project. So at say for something along the lines of a retrofit, energy retrofit of a building, there may be points along there, after a final inspection, after those kinds of official Department of Buildings, let's say, steps where portions of the funding can be made available, but it's always as a reimbursement to funds that have already been spent. So sorry, the short answer to all of that is I would not anticipate even that first disbursement until, sometime in Q3. And that would probably just be for pre-development. If we're talking about, reimbursement for actual funds spent on the project itself, on the capital portion of the project, case by case basis, but I would expect very late this year into early next year, just based on how all the timing of this is working out.
Got it. I saw a couple of questions along these lines, but people were wondering, can an application include multiple project sites?
So short answer to that is yes. Multiple project sites are supported. I will say, when a couple of things that I'll touch on in this one, because I know we've gotten some similar questions via email in the past. So if there's an entity, a nonprofit or a small business who is looking to improve multiple sites that they own as part of a larger ecosystem, absolutely, you can list multiple parcels on your application and move forward that way. If, however, you are an organization who maybe is partnering with multiple different site-based organizations, say you're a nonprofit that is looking to work with other nonprofits who may want to do green infrastructure on their property, and you're working to help them. A couple of things on that front. One, in terms of multiple addresses for one application, if the end user, if the end beneficiary of that project is based at that site, and there's another site where there's another end user and another site with another end user, we would need to see each of those as their own application, because the end user is who we're going to be kind of reviewing along with the project. And so in those instances, our recommendation would be to submit multiple applications. Each project is really its own, but in the narrative of that project, you can tie it thematically to the other projects that are similar. But again, the Climate Infrastructure Fund is not in a position to provide intermediaries with the grant. We are looking to fund the capital improvements directly, and that money is to go to the end user themselves.
Got it. There are a couple of questions about the process that we're going to be using to evaluate meaningful greenhouse gas reductions. One question asked, does this mean that project will be evaluated on the quantity of greenhouse gas reductions? If so, does that mean that larger scale projects will be prioritized over smaller projects? Could you speak a little bit more about the greenhouse gas reduction evaluation portion of the application process?
So I'll go ahead and start that, Luke, and let
Please.
you finish up, clean it up for me. But I think really, and when we think about that, we first want to see an attempt that, whether you tried to calculate it or provide some, qualitative, this will, result in a reduction in greenhouse gases. Definitely understand the question about, will bigger projects just be naturally suited to take priority because of significant reductions? And I think when we talk about meaningful reductions, we're talking more so thinking about either like a percentage, we're reducing our energy consumption by 20% versus, one that's just barely scratching the surface. Or, for example, a project that may be, say we're taking out our gas boiler and we're putting in a heat pump, that, something that is reducing the reliance on natural gas is highly prioritized as well. So I would say that's what we mean by meaningful. Luke, did you want to add to that? And maybe we want to talk about natural gas just in general, but I think I might have seen a question that we, while we understand there are options for efficiencies, with this fund, we won't be funding, energy efficiency solutions that include the purchase of anything that's using natural gas as well. And that's on the website and in the application as well. But Luke, did you want to add to that?
The only thing I was going to say is that, I think, Lindy, you captured it. There's multiple ways that we're interpreting meaningful reductions in emissions. But also that is, one part of many for this application. And so even if on that one line item, a larger project might outweigh others, there are so many other components to what we're reviewing that will, that will not necessarily be a non-starter for smaller projects.
I'd even maybe add an example, an application, let's say there's two applications and one is saying, we're putting solar panels on our roof, and all the great things that go along with that. And then maybe there's another building, another organization that's doing the same thing. Let's say it's the same size building. They're putting relatively similar solar on their roof, but they're also looking at their building envelope and tightening up with added insulation. They're looking at their HVAC and, making sure things are more efficient. Well, then that is going to have deeper reductions and a bigger impact. And so that is showing how, how we would prioritize something like we would probably, if all things lined up with the one that was taking, had deeper reductions, that would be another way to look at it.
Got it. I saw a couple of questions that had related to the $50,000 minimum grant amount. Vanessa Perkins asked, the sites I'm volunteering with for EV charging are nonprofits, and they only cost $6,000 each. And so she asked, how would we advise they submit a portfolio of projects? Would partnering with a larger Chicago-based organization to receive the grant and disperse to individual sites be the best, or I guess what's the way to go about it if you're worried you're not going to meet the minimum amount, if your project isn't going to meet the minimum amount of the grant amount?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So we're not considering the 50,000 a minimum. That's where we see a lot of impact in projects that are in that 50 to 250K range. But we are, absolutely open to considering smaller projects as well. So I would say in that specific example, again, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, we are not in the position to provide grants to an entity who would then disperse those funds to other users. The Climate Infrastructure Fund is really aimed at providing grant funding to the final end user. So in a kind of multi-partner, multi-site project, we would be looking for multiple applications and then some sort of clear indication, maybe in the way the project is named, obviously in how it's talked about, and explicitly discussing that this is part of a broader portfolio in the application. That'll let us kind of look at those together and not really, not simply look at each on its own, although we will also look at each on its own. And again, a lot of the questions about kind of applicant eligibility is based on that end user, who is that end user? So if a nonprofit were, say, applying to help out large businesses as opposed to small businesses, that would not be eligible, because even though the nonprofit might be the central force, the end users are who we're really looking at when we talk about eligibility. And not to ramble this into another answer of a question that hasn't been asked, but forgive me, Lindy, tell me if I missed this. I thought we had something about defining small businesses in our slides. Did I just gloss over when that happened?
I don't think it is defined in there.
Okay.
It is defined on the website.
Yes.
And I will note that the definition comes straight from DPD. So if you want to talk about that definition.
Perfect. I just want to make sure that I wasn't missing an entire slide that happened. So the definition for small businesses that we're using for the Climate Infrastructure Fund is the same that DPD uses on other similar programs. For example, the Small Business Improvement Fund, the SPIF program. And so it's a bit of a mouthful of a definition. I'll direct you to the FAQs on our website for the full list of all the ins and outs on that. But the short answer is commercial businesses who've averaged less than $9 million in revenue over the past 3 years, 9 million each year on average over the past 3 years. It does not include, and then there are a number of exclusions of certain kinds of businesses that are excluded from that regardless of revenue. And so industrial uses, for example, even if it's a small industrial use, is excluded. And there are a number of other kind of use cases like that. So I highly recommend, if you have questions about, is my small business eligible, start there in the FAQs. If you have specific questions about your business, do feel free to reach out. We'll have our email up here at the end of today's session.
Got it. I have a question from somebody who is considering 3 sites for undertaking a project and will eventually choose one. Will an applicant need to have a specific site amount? If they have got a demonstrated path to site control for all 3 sites, would they be able to apply, or would they need to have one site selected before submitting an application?
Yeah, I would say technically, I don't think we would preclude you from including all 3. But I'll say that from a project readiness perspective, if you're still deciding between sites and decide, 3 different sites, unless we're talking about something like EV charging, which even then I would argue, but if it's green infrastructure, anything with building energy use, 3 different sites means 3 very different projects. And so if you're applying with all 3, I would say I'm not sure that looks like a project that is necessarily ready to move forward. But I don't think that you would be disqualified for applying with that.
There have been a lot of questions about residential projects. I know that residential projects are not eligible for the Climate Infrastructure Fund grants, but one person asked, is multifamily housing of more than 5 units considered commercial, or is that also under the umbrella of residential?
Yeah, go ahead, Lindy.
I think we'll follow up, but there are other projects under the scope of the Chicago Recovery Plan for residential, both multifamily and 1 to 4 unit families as well. So I think that information will be coming out and made public later, but we'll follow up specifically about that, unless Luke, you wanted to provide guidance.
Yeah, I was going to say the short answer is that no, that would not be eligible as a small business. As Lindy alluded to, there are other programs directed just towards residential development. And so, but, we'll have a little bit more clarity around where those kind of boundaries are on some of those kinds of uses in the coming weeks.
We have a question about whether the applications will go through a rubric scoring system with scoring criteria, or what's the evaluation process like that the city will be using?
Yeah, great question. So yes, there will be a scoring rubric that we'll be using. It is again, given that this is our first launch of this program, it's still, frankly, in a little bit of a draft form, but by the end of February, when applications are rolling in, that will be in place, and the review will happen by city staff, both within DPD and our partner agencies, partner departments, and there will be, eventually a program manual. Which for all of these CRP programs, which would be, something that folks can look at to kind of understand the background methodology of those kinds of things.
We've got a couple of questions about whether churches or religious institutions would be eligible for the grant. My understanding is that's something that might still need to be determined, but I want to confirm that with staff.
Yeah, I think we'll need to follow up on that. I believe the current DPD definition of small businesses for other programs has traditionally excluded houses of worship. But we'll follow up, on the website with more clarity on that front.
I saw maybe a couple of questions related to, would it be possible for grants to cover 100% of project expenses, or is there an expectation that some contributions will be made by the applicant?
Great question. Yeah. Yes, 100% of eligible expenses are allowed. We're not expecting any specific percentage to be covered by the applicant, but I will say there are a number of costs that we anticipate with any project that simply won't be eligible for grant funding. So I would expect that to be captured in the project budgets that are submitted in the application, and understanding that there are other costs that this fund cannot cover. But no, 100% of eligible costs, basically up to that $250,000 limit, would be eligible.
We do ask in the application for you to share if there is additional financing that you have already obtained, whether it's through a grant or, say you're going to put a couple thousand from your budget, or maybe you're pursuing something that you don't have an answer, from the, granting agency. Those sorts of things, please do include that if you are thinking of multiple funding sources. So that is something that we do want to know. But yes, all eligible expenses are, it can go up to 100%, keeping in mind that we are asking you to tell us about other expenditures, long-term maintenance, who's your operating staff? Are you training them on the solar panels or whatever, so we do want to see that, and are asking that you are aware and thinking about what that looks like longer term.
We have a question here that's I think asking basically how detailed do the cost estimates have to be? Do these have to be firm estimates that have already been verified with a contractor or an outside consultant, or can a nonprofit generate their own estimates to be verified at a later date?
Yeah, we will accept applications that don't have contractor verified estimates. But again, to the idea of project readiness, applications that do have those figures vetted and verified will be stronger applications. But it is not a requirement. We are allowing folks to estimate themselves on the front end.
We have a question here getting more specific. Can EV charging sites that are on city-owned land or in the public way, can they qualify for funding to facilitate community ownership?
So right now, we've talked about site control. You either need to own it or have permission from another private owner. It may come to be that someday there is an opportunity for things in the public right away, but for right now, for this program, it would not be allowed. There are bigger kind of longer term outlook analyses that are happening in this space. And as you probably are aware, the world of EVs are very fast changing. And so that may change, but for right now, in round one, no, not city owned property. And Luke, please add to that if I've mischaracterized anything or you want to add anything.
Nope, that's right. We're looking at private property investments only at this moment.
Got it. And then another person asked, are there city approved contractors for EV stations that have pre-negotiated prices with the city, so fundees can save more money through a volume discount?
We do not have anything like that, although I will say, one, that's a fantastic idea. and would love to explore that. Right now, and if you look on the resources page, I believe it is, we do highlight where you can go to see the state's list of certified contractors in this space. But no, we do not currently have a list like that. But I really appreciate that idea, and we'll mention it to the right people.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in to say, because we have gotten a number of questions prior to today on kind of preferred vendor lists. So I can, at least speaking for the Department of Planning and Development, we do not maintain any kind of a preferred vendor list. For lack of a better way of putting it, we're not permitted to do so as a city entity. What we can do is point folks in the direction of entities who maybe have their own lists. For example, ComEd, I know, has a list of installers that they promote. And then, as Lindy alluded to, at the state government level, because that's where the certifications happen, they have a list of certified installers. And so those are lists that we can point folks towards. But at the moment, at least, unless something drastic were to change, DPD would not be able to provide or assemble a list of preferred contractors or vendors or installers.
I know that the project cap the grant cap, the suggested grant cap is $250,000. Someone asked if their project costs are over $250,000. Should they list the total amount, and would that allow them to be considered for more grant funding, or should they just apply for $250,000 of their total project costs?
The application is going to ask you to show your full budget of the project, and what your ask is. So I think that's how it is, Luke. Do you remind me? I feel like
That's right.
yeah. And so you'll be able to indicate in there what your requested amount is and what your total budget is.
That's right. And this might be a good opportunity to jump in and say, for any application, regardless of the amount that you may identify as a shortfall, that's not necessarily going to 100% coincide with what that eventual grant award may be. So yes, please do fill out the budget, to the amount that you understand it, and then grant awards will kind of be made on a case-by-case basis.
We had a question from one person who was curious whether construction material landfill diversion programs would be a part of our definition of green infrastructure.
Not currently. We are looking at additional kind of circular economy and waste things possibly for another round, but not at this time. Luke, did you want to add anything to that?
No, just to say that's accurate. And I would say for kind of a broader answer, again, the fund is there to it's for capital improvement projects. So while we have specific definitions of what we mean by energy efficiency and renewable energy, EVs and EV charging, green infrastructure, the kind of broader category to keep in mind as you're thinking about a project is it a physical improvement to a building or a site? Those are the kinds of things that we can fund. If it's more process driven or operations or maintenance, those are completely ineligible. Maybe we'll do maybe one or two more questions, David, and then we'll try to close things out.
And I'll also add that we will take a close look at all of the questions, answered and unanswered, and work to provide responses. We'll do our best to get that by the end of the week, just to make sure that we've covered all our bases here. And we also we'll share the slides, but there's an email address that you can continue to email questions as well. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's good. Somebody was curious, will selected projects still need to go through the, city's building permit program and, go through a licensed architect and engineer, or is DPD the authority for giving approvals to proceed, for projects that qualify?
No, great question. Absolutely, any project that, would normally require a building permit or any other permit from another department, say CDOT, or anyone else, absolutely continues to have to go through those processes. So DPD is kind of the funding agency, and that's where that kind of ends. Of course, if there's anything that requires zoning approval, that goes through DPD as well, but it does so just as any other project would. There's no kind of shortcuts or anything simply because you're a grant recipient.
Someone was curious whether industrial companies are eligible for the grant.
Yeah, so industrial uses are not eligible at this time. Again, take a look at the FAQs on our website, where we have that kind of exhaustive list of the current definition of small business for this program. But as Lindy alluded to, there may still be some moving pieces on that front, but no, industrial is not eligible as a small business. I might make that our last question. I do see, we've got many more that we haven't gotten to yet. So thank you all for asking those. I'm just gonna kind of switch screens here. So Lindy alluded to the fact that we will, of course, be going through those Q&As. I think I saw a question in there. Somebody asked, can we get a copy of the Q&A chat? The way that we'll be sharing that back out with all of you is on the FAQs themselves. And so, again, chicago.gov/climate fund is where you can find all the information related to the Climate Infrastructure Fund. That includes resources that we've been alluding to and the FAQs. And as Lindy mentioned, we'll be aiming to update those by the end of the week, so that they capture all the great questions that you all have given us thus far. If there's anything we haven't gotten a chance to get to, and I'm sure there's much, or you think of something later, or whatever it is, any questions, our email is right there, climatefund@cityofchicago.org. We try to respond as promptly as we can. And then when we do reply to those questions, if we realize it's something that we haven't covered on the website before, we go ahead and we update the FAQs as well. So please feel free to reach out via those means, and we will get back to you and update information as much as we can. And as we alluded to earlier as well, we will be having a second webinar on February 2nd. We'll be confirming the time of that here in the next week or so. And the content may be a little bit different just because we know many of you will be kind of in the middle of your application process at that point. So with that, I want to thank my fellow panelists, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We are so excited to get this off the ground, and to have 150 plus people here on this call with us today is really heartening to know that there's that much interest. And so we hope to see applications from all of you in the very near future. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.